On this episode of Death Row Stories, a house fire claims the lives of two young boys.
They hated him. They wanted blood.
Someone must be held accountable.
14 years later, the prosecution charges their father with murder.
Daniel Dougherty was a man who could turn his emotions on and off.
But when the state's fire forensics come into question,
what they were selling was just bad science.
cracks in the case come to light.
She said I put an innocent man on death row, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Why they lying? Why they cheating? Because they don't want to admit they did wrong.
There's a body in the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
August 24th, 1985 was a quiet night in Philadelphia's Oxford Circle community. But during the overnight hours, a tragedy would awaken the neighborhood.
I'm at my house, and my mom gives me a call, and she's like, Kathy's house is on fire. What do you mean? And she's like, it's on fire. It's gone. The whole house is gone.
Outside the row house stood 25-year-old Daniel Dougherty, frantic. His two young children, Johnny and Danny Jr., were asleep on the second floor. Now, they were trapped.
Daniel's hysterical outside. He's trying to break his way into the house. He's trying to grab a hose.
He grabbed the hose. He's trying to squirt the doorway to get back in. He's trying to squirt where the windows were. But the fire was so hot, if it didn't blow stuff out, it melted it. Nothing's gonna work.
When police arrive on the scene, Daniel is so frantic that the police attempt to restrain him, and they push him down onto the ground. Everyone
comes out. Everybody's, where are the boys? Where are the boys? My mom, she just starts crying. It was bad.
The house belonged to Dougherty's girlfriend, Kathy Schuler, who was at a friend's house nearby.
We got a phone call saying that my house was on fire. We drove back up to the neighborhood and we prayed the whole way up there, prayed the whole way to that street. And I still didn't know. Like, I didn't know that they were there, that they were gone. I didn't know.
Firefighters would discover 4-year-old Danny Jr. and 3-year-old Johnny dead in the bed they shared.
This can't really be real. I was playing with those boys the day before. We were playing. And then you blink and then they're gone. Everything, the whole house was gone.
Outside the house, authorities asked Dougherty his name. His answer caught them by surprise. "My name is Mud, and I should die for what I did."
Within hours of the fire, the police want to talk to Dougherty. He says, "Sure, I'll talk to you." He doesn't ask for an attorney, doesn't refuse to answer their questions. And in fact, one of the officers says to him, "Do you want to waive your right to be silent?" Dougherty says, "I ain't got nothing to be silent about." Dougherty's story is that he went to sleep on the couch, he wakes up, the house is burning, his instinctive reaction is to run outside, and that's what he does. And then flames were too intense. He couldn't get back into the house.
5 days later, police again questioned Dougherty and his girlfriend, Kathy.
They asked me if I would be willing to take the polygraph, and I said yes, because I didn't have anything to hide. I was in there for hours. I mean, hours. You know, good cop, bad cop. They said, have you ever lied to protect someone that you love? Their take on was that I knew he did it, but I was protecting him.
According to police, both Dougherty and Kathy failed their polygraphs, but while there was lingering suspicion of arson, police lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest. Dougherty and Kathy were released, and the case was closed.
This was a family block, and 2 babies died on this block. Women wanted blood. The men were furious. They wanted him gone.
After the fire, I died. I was mourning my boys day and night, and I basically lived at the cemetery. I was there most of the time. And without my boys, I didn't want to go home.
After the fire, Danny was, needless to say, distraught. It got strained, our relationship got strained. He wasn't drinking for a while, and then he started drinking, and when he started drinking, that's when I stopped seeing him.
I was drinking a lot. That's all I did. I crawled into a bottle, and then I crawled out and started living again. But that wasn't until years later.
3 years after the fire, Dougherty met a new girlfriend, Adrian. They married and had a son.
When Stephen was born, I felt like a man again. He's my world. I spent as much time as I could with him. We did everything together.
My dad was my hero. Even in bad situations, he'd make them into good situations. If it was a rainy day, he had this truck. It was a humongous monster truck. The tires were illegal for city limits, but he didn't care. He'd take us through puddles. Every winter, he'd grab all the kids in the family, go sledding. He made life better for a child.
In 1997, Dougherty's marriage to Stephen's mother, Adrian, ended in a bitter divorce. Not long after, Stephen was confronted by his father's past.
I found out about the age of 3 or 4. It just came up one day. I was playing with fire. My dad called me, and he said, "Do you want to end up just like your brothers?" And that's when I found out that I had 2 dead brothers. I didn't know the whole story, but I knew it would hurt my dad because I seen the emotion in his eyes.
"14 years had passed since the fire, but one day, police appeared at Daniel's door.
I went willingly. They didn't tell me they were locking me up. They just told me, "We got a couple questions." I said, "Okay, no problem."
It was supposed to be his weekend to come grab me, and my mom said he wouldn't be coming to get me anymore. And I got really upset because I didn't quite understand what was going on at the time.
I don't cover courts or law enforcement. I covered this case because my editor came up to me and said, "This guy's been charged 14 years after the crime occurred. Why don't you look into it and see if there's a story there?"
Investigators had received new evidence from someone close to Daniel. Evidence strong enough to charge Daniel with the death penalty.
My ex told them I confessed to her. Her lying and getting me put in prison for a crime I never did and a crime that never was.
When Daniel was arrested, he was in the middle of a custody battle with an ex-wife, Adrian Sussman. She says that Dougherty confessed to her multiple times. So it's that impetus, that statement from her, that drives his arrest.
Daniel's death penalty trial began in September 2000. Judge Renee Hughes presided over the trial and ruled that Daniel's ex-wife would not be allowed to testify.
Daniel Dougherty's defense attorney filed a motion for exercise of spousal privilege. What they used to say in the old case law is pillow talk. What spouses share cannot be brought into the courtroom to be used against that person.
But the prosecution had backup. 2 jailhouse informants who claimed to have spoken with Daniel.
2 men come in and say that Daniel Dougherty confessed to them that he had killed his kids and he was crying in his jail cell every night.
The informant's testimony was incredibly consistent on details that were not in the newspapers. They were in 2 different jails. There was no connection between the 2 of them. There was reason for the jury to credit the testimony that they brought to the table.
For 14 years, Dougherty never confessed to anybody. So he is immediately confessing to 2 people who he never met the minute he's put in jail. That raises a big question in my mind.
Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Kathy, was asked to walk the jury through the events the night of the fire.
It was a Friday, and I was working. I worked at a bingo hall, and Danny was supposed to be in an AA meeting and then go back home. But I got home, and, the girls were still there that babysat, and it was late. So I got mad, found him at the bar that I knew he would be at, and I went in and I told him, get home to your kids.
Before going home, Daniel stopped to visit his first wife and the mother of the boys, Kathleen.
The record established that they had an argument. She said she'd come back the next day to pick up the children.
When Daniel finally got home, he found a note from his girlfriend, Kathy.
I had written a stupid note. I don't even remember writing it, but I told him that I was leaving, and I don't know what else I said in there.
From that point, Daniel Dougherty asserts that he went to sleep on the couch. Commonwealth asserts that Dougherty set 3 points of fire. The house was engulfed. The boys died.
Supposedly, he's so angry with his girlfriend and with his former wife that he sets the fire.
Philadelphia Assistant Fire Marshal John Quinn, a 23-year veteran who investigated the house fire, testified that burn patterns showed the fire had ignited in 3 different places, which proved it had been set intentionally.
Quinn looks like the kind of expert witness you would see on TV, very dignified, authoritative in his speech. Quinn says the fire is set in 3 places: a sofa, a love seat, and under a table. Quinn says the fire is definitely arson. He knows it when he sees it. I didn't question it. This is a public official. This is the guy who investigates fires for a living. I did expect that the defense was going to come back with their own expert witness to nullify his testimony, and that never occurred. Quinn's testimony stood alone as to the cause of the fire.
The defense decided to let Daniel testify on his own behalf. The strategy backfired.
Daniel Dougherty was a man who could turn his emotions on and off and wasn't necessarily consistent.
This is where Dougherty hurts himself in his testimony. He's combative. The assistant district attorney asks him a question, and Dougherty says, wrong, like this is like a game show or something. He's asked, were you angry for being nagged? And Dougherty looks at the jury and says, all women nag. There are 9 women on the jury. There was the moment when Dougherty says, in the first moments of the fire, he has a clear path up the stairs to the children, and he doesn't take it. He runs out the door, and you could see the jury recoil from that.
It was the jury that decided credibility, and ultimately this case turned on credibility.
The trial lasted 4 days, but it took less than 3 hours for the jury to convict Daniel Dougherty of first-degree murder and arson. He was sentenced to death.
When my mom first told me that I wouldn't be seeing my father anymore, my reaction, it was pain, because at the time, my father was my hero. As every little boy looks up to their dad, that's their Superman. Do whatever he can for you. And he was no longer there for me.
I once believed in the justice system. I didn't know more. How can you put an innocent man on death row? I was in a fog. I stayed in my cell. To me, that was it. I was welcoming death.
4 years after being sent to death row for the murder of his 2 sons, Daniel Dougherty found hope in a new team of attorneys who agreed to take on his appeals pro bono.
When we first got the case, there were a number of flags, but certainly the 14-year delay from fire to arrest raised serious questions. It was not until he was in the midst of a custody battle that Daniel's ex-wife, Adrienne, went to police and claimed that Daniel, during their marriage, had confessed on multiple occasions to having set the fire that killed the 2 boys and had done so using accelerant.
The police knew the gasoline had not been used to set this fire because they had tested for the presence of an accelerant and had found no evidence of that.
Certainly, one could imagine that she went to the police in order to try and get leverage or an upper hand in that custody battle.
My dad was gonna go for full custody because my mom had issues with drugs. She was scared she was gonna lose me to my father, so she acted the only way she knew how to act, and that was to take my father out of the picture. After my dad got incarcerated, she became twice as much of an alcoholic and twice as much of a drug addict. And the one day she broke down, she said, "I put an innocent man on death row, and there's nothing I could do about it."
At the time that we got involved in 2004, Adrienne had recanted, and she had told members of the family she didn't believe that Daniel was involved in the fire. She never testified in any proceeding, and she died several years ago of a drug overdose.
While Daniel's ex-wife's accusations had opened the door to his arrest, it was a testimony of Fire Marshal John Quinn that pointed to guilt.
The prosecution had a very experienced public servant in Lieutenant Quinn who testified definitively and persuasively that I can tell from these burn patterns, and I can tell you without doubt that this fire was intentionally set and was set in 3 places.
In preparing Daniel's appeals, the defense reached out to renowned fire investigator John Lentini.
There's maybe, 75,000 suspicious fires every year. That's 75,000 chances to get it wrong. The lawyers who were working pro bono give me a call and see what I could do with the case. John Quinn said he could see 3 points of origin. So I looked at the photographs and I didn't see it. It's supposed to jump out at you. And there's no way that you could say with any credibility that this fire started in more than one place. What they were selling was just bad science. But, they sold it at the top of their lungs.
Lentini had seen this problem before. A long history of faulty fire science had led to a number of questionable verdicts.
Fire investigators are the ones who decide the cause of a fire. But what if everything they've learned about fires and arson is out of date and flat out wrong?
If you go back to 1977, there was a book came out, Arson Investigation, Survey and Assessment. And they listed artifacts that you would see after a set fire. Crazed glass, tiny little spiderweb-like cracks, alligatoring, big shiny char blisters. There were several indicators that people used to determine whether a fire was arson. I used to believe in this stuff. And then in 1991, there was this huge fire in Oakland, California. It burned 3,000 houses in a space of 24 hours. And I looked at it and I said, what an opportunity. Because I've got 3,000 known accidental fires. Now I can go see what an accidental fire looks like. I went out there with 2 colleagues and we went to 50 houses. And we found melted steel, we found melted copper, we found crazed glass. We could have said any one of these fires in isolation, oh, this looks like an arson fire.
In 1992, a committee of experts published a new industry guide for investigating fires. Their report, known as NFPA 921, changed the way fires were investigated. It also fueled controversy.
The fire investigation community collectively had its head explode. They went nuts. They hated the book. They said it was all wrong. around 2000. That's when 921 became generally accepted. But some of them still don't like NFPA 921 because it says what you were doing back in the old days was wrong. Who wants to admit that they've sent an innocent person to prison?
On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by the state of Texas. For Daniel's team, the case was strikingly similar to his own.
Willingham was sentenced to death after he was convicted of setting this house fire, which killed his 3 young daughters.
Willingham, like Daniel, was convicted. After that execution, fire science experts, including John Lentini, took a close look.
The arson investigation found that the original investigators had relied on outdated arson science.
But what I have seen that the fire marshal put forward as evidence of arson is not evidence of arson.
I was trained, it's better to let 10 guilty people go than to convict one innocent person.
With Lentini's fire assessment in hand, Daniel's team filed their appeal in November 2006. Among their arguments was the defense's lack of a fire expert at the original trial. But the biggest claim would be lodged against Daniel's trial judge, Renee Hughes, who was also slated to oversee his appeal.
Judge Hughes, at a hearing, made a statement on the record about Daniel being a vile human being and toasting a house with his children in it. Based on those statements, we did not believe that she could fairly decide the appeal, and that's why we filed a motion for her to be recused.
While Daniel's defense had noted Judge Hughes's comments, the term vile human was nowhere to be found in the transcripts. They accused Judge Hughes of foul play.
I don't know why the statement wasn't in the transcript. I didn't direct a court reporter to do anything. That's not my style. If I say it, it can be repeated. But that hearing was over, and so the court reporter closed the record. Nothing about the way in which I handled this case negatively impacted Daniel Dougherty. The jury didn't know what I thought and doesn't know what I think.
Judge Hughes denied the ineffective assistance of counsel claim, and she denied the motion to recuse. We then were in a position to appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
On December 30th, 2013, the Pennsylvania Superior Court removed Judge Hughes from the case. And after 11 years on death row, Daniel was granted a new trial.
We were certainly cautiously optimistic that we would get really a fair hearing at the second trial.
This makes me live. It makes me happy, and that's what keeps the smile on my face.
Second trial. A lot of people were in high hopes that my dad was going to come home.
There is no possible way that he would have ever done this to my brothers because he said that they were his angels.
My heart was broken when they lost my boys. My heart was broken when they locked me up. My heart was broken when they convicted me of a crime I did not do. They disgraced my name. I want my name cleared. Because this is a horrible, horrible thing I'm accused of that I did not do. So I didn't think there was any hope of justice. But yet I had to fight for my sons.
As a reporter, I was really interested in the second trial because I thought the first one left so many unanswered questions. David Fryman and Shannon Farmer were arguing that fire science had evolved and it was fair to take a new look at this evidence.
During Dougherty's first trial, Fire Marshal John Quinn had claimed that burn patterns proved the fire had been set intentionally. After reviewing the same photos, John Lentini, the defense's fire expert, saw another possibility.
This chair is stuffed with plastic foam. The steady heat of a cigarette accidentally dropped between the cushions can create a disaster.
This is from a video called Countdown to Disaster from 1984.
The carpet and other furnishings start to break down into vaporous fuels. Then, within seconds, in a process called flashover, everything in the room erupts into flame. No life survives flashover.
Lentini believed the fire in Daniel's home had reached flashover, fully engulfing the structure. This would explain the burn patterns Quinn had attributed to arson.
Dougherty's story about running out, not being able to get back in, it's consistent with behavior that I've seen in other cases where people said, oh, the fire started and it burned too fast, therefore it must have been accelerated. It's not true. Quinn is, of the old school. And back in the day when he learned his trade, furniture wasn't made out of polyurethane. It was made out of cotton batting and stuff that burned slowly. So he wasn't used to seeing fires that burned very quickly.
Kathy, the ex-girlfriend, had told the police that there were several people who were smoking in the house that night. There was also a kerosene heater that was right next to the sofa.
Dougherty was a smoker, he was drunk, and he was asleep on the sofa. I would say that you can't rule out a cigarette as a cause of this fire. It's just not that hard to determine arson, if it really is arson. Find puddles of gasoline in a living room, incendiary devices. But determining the cause of an accidental fire is quite a bit more difficult. Problem when you're trying to send someone to prison is you got to prove that it happened. And you got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Armed with these new advances, the opening arguments of Daniel Dougherty's second trial began on March 22, 2016. But the man whose testimony had helped convict him, John Quinn, was noticeably absent.
He sent a letter to us making quite clear that he wanted nothing to do with testifying at the second trial, that he understood there had been incalculable advances in fire science over the last 10 years, that he had not kept up with those, and that the best that he could say is the opinions that he gave at the time were his honest opinions at the time.
Despite Quinn's absence, Judge Scott O'Keefe, who presided over Daniel's second trial, allowed Quinn's previous testimony to be read into the record.
They actually have somebody sit in the witness stand and read Lieutenant Quinn's lines. That's how it gets read into the jury. So they're seeing a person basically act as Lieutenant Quinn.
Unable to cross-examine Quinn, Daniel's defense struggled to poke holes in his investigation. And when defense expert John Lentini took the stand to introduce the new advances in fire science, prosecutor Jude Conroy seized the moment.
When Lentini is on the stand, Jude Conroy just attacks, calling him names. He says he's someone who would whore himself out for a consultant's fee, and that he's a liar. And Lentini gets flustered. I don't think he was expecting that kind of aggression.
He yelled. He just screamed at me for the better part of 2 days. They let Jude Conroy just run that courtroom. And he was just awful.
Lentini brought expertise and knowledge, but he seemed unprepared at times, and the prosecution exploited that.
Jude Conroy also called Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Kathy Schuler, to the stand, prompting her to reveal a darker side of Daniel's character.
Danny was abusive. He was physical. He hit me, he blacked my eye, he pulled me by the head of my hair on my knees from one side of the street to the other. And he hurt me. He scared me. And his ex-wife, the mother of the kids, he beat her too.
When Daniel and Kathy were together, you inevitably heard a brawl. And the boys would come out. We'd try and play with them to keep them so they're not paying attention to the yelling. But you always heard screaming. Always.
After I stopped seeing him, he was angry. I didn't go out of the house. I had nightmares. I had visions that he came in the window that's locked and you can't even come in. I had fear. I had a lot of fear.
Despite Daniel's abusive history, when Kathy took the stand, she didn't blame him for the fire or the death of his children.
I knew from the first time that they said he tried to get back at his ex and myself that night. I knew that was a lie. I knew that wasn't his motive. It couldn't have never been his motive. Because I know how much he loved those boys. I know how much he loved them. He would have never taken that chance.
The emotionally charged trial intensified when the prosecution introduced a graphic image. The bodies of Danny Jr. and Johnny in the bed where they were found.
The prosecution was allowed to introduce one photo, and they blew it up. This is like a poster-sized photograph. It was impossible not to look at it.
I walked out. I didn't want to see my brothers hugging each other burnt, because I know that would have scarred me.
It was horrific. Jurors looked ill, as you would expect.
When we came back in, you could see it in their faces that a lot has changed in their demeanor.
Jude Conroy told the jury that's what this case is about. It's two lost children, and someone must be held accountable, and that person is their father.
The courtroom was quiet. After the jury left, I tried to say I love you to my dad. And as soon as my dad turned around and said I love you back, the judge threatened to kick me out.
The jury would find Daniel guilty of arson and second-degree murder.
Daniel was acquitted of first-degree murder, but the jury found that he intentionally set the fire. The two boys who perished in the fire, Daniel bears responsibility for that act.
Judge O'Keefe sentenced Daniel to 2 consecutive life terms. From the bench, he declared, "I haven't seen this despicable a crime in a long time."
As far as we were concerned, Daniel didn't belong in prison, so therefore still facing life in prison wasn't really a victory, and we were focused on trying to get him a new trial.
As Daniel started serving his life sentence, his team appealed, arguing that the photo of Daniel's dead children played on the jury's emotions, and that his history of abuse had nothing to do with the case. 18 months later, in a rare move, the Pennsylvania Superior Court agreed, again overturning Daniel's conviction.
I was amazed that they got a second trial, and to get a third was truly rabbit out of the hat.
I just could not believe that he got the third trial. Could not believe it. I actually had hope for him.
Rather than try the case again, the district attorney offered Daniel a deal.
On the eve of the trial, the district attorney's office offered a non-negotiable plea that Daniel would plead guilty to 1 count of arson and 2 counts of third-degree murder. And it would be called what's called an open plea, which means it would be up to the judge exclusively to decide on the sentence.
Daniel did not accept that deal. I think there may have been a couple reasons for that. One is that he might actually be telling the truth, that he's innocent, and that's what he's always said. The other factor that may have come into play, there was no guarantee that he would get out of prison. He could still be there for life. This just meant that the parole board would consider him for relief.
On March 27, 2019, Daniel returned to court for his third trial. Judge Scott O'Keefe once again presided. But this time, the prosecution would take a different tack.
They were not trying to show that he was trying to kill the children. They were trying to show that he had intentionally set the fire.
Essentially arguing that even if Daniel had no intent that anybody get hurt, that once he intentionally set that fire, game over. He has to live with all the consequences.
The state's key witness, Fire Marshal John Quinn, had passed away years earlier. In his place, prosecutors called on Quinn's colleague, Thomas Schneiders.
Thomas Schneiders essentially reviewed Lieutenant Quinn's report and got up on the stand and rubber-stamped those conclusions and findings and reiterated them. Our view is that that testimony has no scientific basis and so, in fact, should never get to a jury.
National Fire Protection Association writes the rules for the industry. Dozens of courts have held that if you don't follow NFPA 921, you don't get to put your opinion before the jury. I don't know how Mr. Schneiders can say that he followed 921 and agreeing with Quinn that there must have been arson. I think that if they're faced with two competing experts, the jury doesn't have the experience or the knowledge to decide which one of those experts got it right.
One of the things that's frustrating is the willingness of the court to accept the way that things have always been done, even when there is scientific evidence showing that that doesn't really have validity anymore.
If you're looking for doubt, consider the fact that he was not charged until 14 years after the crime. The fact that nobody saw him strike the match. The fact that there was dispute over how the fire actually occurred. All those things I felt could have raised a question in a jury's mind.
The defense wanted to focus on the fire science. They didn't give any weight to the statements of the witnesses who heard Daniel Dougherty admit that he had committed this crime. The jury did.
In April 2019, after a third jury had found him guilty, Daniel Dougherty was about to learn his sentence. In protest, he refused to enter the courtroom. So Judge Scott O'Keefe took his ruling to Daniel.
Judge Scott O'Keefe left the bench and walked over to the doorway, yelling in, "Mr. Dougherty, what you did that night was despicable just to get back at your girlfriend and estranged wife. You burnt your own 2 children to death."
Judge O'Keefe's actions throughout the second and third trials are now at the center of Daniel's appeals.
I knew I wasn't getting a fair trial from when they first locked me up. I have no hope I'll ever get out because they do not want to admit they put an innocent man in prison, let alone on death row.
He's been in prison for 20 years now, since he was arrested in 1999, and he believes that he's been unfairly convicted multiple times. He's had multiple judges who've made statements that were inflammatory and disparaging of him, so he's very frustrated.
The case has ravaged Daniel. He was a young man when he entered prison. Every judge that has heard his case has been overturned, and he continues to maintain his innocence.
I know it's our system. I just hope to God I never, ever, ever have to be judged by a jury of my peers. I hope no one I know does.
It has been said that if you survive a fire that your children die in, you might as well just run back in there and die, because you're going to get blamed for it. And the truth be told, if you're in a courtroom sitting next to a defense attorney, you've got to prove yourself innocent. This innocent till proven guilty, it's a nice thought, but it doesn't obtain very often in American courtrooms.
This case has been tried 3 times, 3 juries of 12. 36 citizens have examined the body of evidence and came to the same conclusion. I think all humans have emotions about the loss of life, but when the victim is a child, it's hard on jurors. The community should rest soundly that Daniel Dougherty was treated fairly.
When Daniel was arrested 14 years after the fire, people were relieved. They wanted him to be guilty. They wanted someone to be guilty. I was ecstatically happy he was going to sit on death row till the day he died. And then I started reading some of the old reports, and some things were questionable. If he's guilty, if he's innocent, I don't know. But when you hear me say that I have questions now about his ability to commit this crime, considering how much I hated him, it's a big deal.
I actually had someone say to me, I don't care if he did it or not, he beat women. He should be where he is. And I can see how a jury would think, here's a man that hits a woman. What kind of man can he be? A loving father?
This one says innocent on death row. This one is for my brothers, Johnny and Danny. On my leg, I have my dad's state number, and I have like a demon holding a cross because I don't agree with our judicial system and the way they screwed over my father.
I keep fighting. I hope one day I'll be able to, well, I can barely walk now, but I would like to walk out of here. At the very least, I would like my sons to carry me out, one way or the other.